I got a job as a park ranger. There are strange rules to follow. Being a park ranger was supposed to be tranquil, days spent exploring trails, assisting lost hikers, and immersing myself in nature. But Blackwood National Forest is unlike any other. It doesn't appear on official maps, nor is it listed in any guidebooks. When I was offered the job, the instructions were unambiguous: never discuss the forest with outsiders, never ask questions, and, most importantly, always adhere to the ranger directives. This forest defies nature. The trees are unnaturally tall, their trunks twisted and charred as though they had burned yet never collapsed. The wildlife is unsettling. Some creatures have eyes that glow in the dark, and their calls carry an eerie, almost human-like quality. Upon my arrival, I was handed a laminated card detailing the ranger directives. The ink appeared freshly printed, as if it was frequently revised. Ranger Captain Wilson introduced me to a representative from Black Hollow Forestry, who passed me the card with an odd smile. "If you break the rules, you won't survive the night. Understand?" I nodded, though I didn't fully grasp the gravity of his words. Not then. Ranger directives. 1. Stick to the designated trails from sunset to sunrise. Even a single misstep into the brush is fatal. 2. If you hear a child crying, do not approach. Do not attempt to help. Cover your ears and keep moving. 3. If the forest falls silent, locate the nearest tree with carvings and stand beneath it until the sounds return. Do not look upward. 4. Avoid Devil's Ridge at night. Something lurks beyond the tree line, and it despises being seen. 5. If you encounter a deer with antlers that spiral unnaturally, do not make eye contact. If it begins to follow you, run. 6. Mirror Lake is safe during daylight hours. After nightfall, maintain a distance of at least 50 feet from the shoreline. 7. If you hear your name whispered, do not respond. It isn't who you think it is. 8. If you see lights hovering among the trees, turn back immediately. They are not fireflies. At first, I assumed the directives were part of some elaborate prank, a way to scare the rookie ranger. Yet, despite my skepticism, I followed them. From the very beginning, there was something deeply unsettling about the forest. Towering trees loomed overhead, their twisted branches grasping at the sky. The trails were bordered by moss-covered stones and carved symbols in tree bark, markings that meant nothing to me. During the day, the forest was unnervingly quiet. Too quiet. No birds singing, no insects buzzing, only the occasional whisper of wind rustling through the leaves. As dusk settled, the air turned colder and the shadows stretched longer. I remained on the path, just as the directives instructed. At approximately 9 p.m., the forest went silent. I halted mid-step, my heartbeat thundering in my ears. Even my own breathing sounded deafening in the unnatural stillness. My mind raced, recalling the third directive: find a carved tree, stand beneath it, and never look up. Desperately, I scanned my surroundings and spotted a marked trunk about 20 feet away. The carvings were deeper here, older, emanating a faint, eerie glow in the dim light. Pressing my back against the bark, I clutched my flashlight tightly and waited. The silence stretched on, feeling infinite. Then, somewhere within the woods, I heard it, the gentle crunch of footsteps on dried leaves. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to fix my gaze straight ahead. "Don't look up! Don't look up!" The footsteps approached, slow and deliberate, until they halted just behind me. My breath hitched as an oppressive presence loomed over me, suffocating and ice-cold. The air turned frigid, and I detected the faint rustling of fabric, as if something had shifted its weight. Then, gradually, the normal sounds of the forest returned: distant birdsong, the whisper of the wind through the canopy. Whatever had stood behind me was gone. I remained motionless, frozen against the tree, until my shift ended at dawn. The second night began uneventfully. I patrolled the trails, keeping my flashlight beam low to avoid attracting attention. At midnight, movement caught my eye ahead of me, a figure weaving between the trees. Initially, I assumed it was a hiker, tall, with an awkward, stuttering gait. "Hello?" I called, violating protocol. My voice echoed unnaturally in the night, but the figure didn't respond. Steeling myself, I inched forward, shining my flashlight toward it. The figure stopped moving, its head tilting at an unnatural angle. Then, without warning, the forest plunged into darkness. My flashlight flickered and failed. Above me, a faint green glow materialized in the treetops. At first, I mistook them for fireflies, small, floating specks of light drifting lazily through the branches. But as they moved closer, I realized my mistake. They weren't fireflies. The lights didn't flicker. They pulsed, slow, rhythmic, like beating hearts. And they weren't aimless. They were coming toward me. Panic surged through me. I spun around and ran, tearing down the trail, ignoring the branches that scraped at my arms and face. The glowing orbs followed, their eerie illumination intensifying. Drawing nearer. Closer. I didn't dare look back. By the time I reached the ranger station, my legs were on fire, and my lungs felt like they might explode. I slammed the door behind me, locking it securely. Outside, the lights hovered just beyond the windows, their glow pulsing in the darkness like a warning. Every night in Blackwood National Forest felt worse than the last. The ranger directives had kept me alive, but they didn't bring me any comfort. Something out there was watching, lurking just beyond the trails, waiting for me to make a mistake. I started noticing patterns. The same strange symbols carved into the trees always appeared near places where the directives were most rigid. Devil's Ridge seemed to hum faintly, almost as though the forest itself was alive. One evening, I found a crumpled scrap of paper tucked into my desk drawer at the station. It wasn't part of the laminated directives, but the handwriting matched. It read, "The directives don't just protect you. They keep it contained." I still didn't know what it was, but every time I entered that forest, I felt as though I was one wrong step away from discovering the truth. The third night started as the others had, cold, quiet, and heavy with tension. I walked the marked trails with my flashlight aimed low, repeating the directives in my head. By this point, they were second nature, etched into my memory like a lifeline in this eerie and unwelcoming place. A little after 1 a.m., I heard it, a child crying. At first, the sound was distant, carried by the wind like an echo from somewhere far away. But as I moved farther down the trail, the cries became sharper, more defined, a high-pitched sob filled with fear and desperation. I froze in place, every instinct screaming at me to leave. Directive 2, if you hear a child crying, do not approach. Do not offer help. Cover your ears and keep walking. But the voice didn't seem far away anymore. It was close. Too close, I could hear the shaky breaths between the sobs. "Help me," the voice pleaded, breaking into another cry. I clenched my fists, forcing my legs to keep moving. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it would burst from my chest. I covered my ears and kept my eyes straight ahead. "Please," the voice sobbed. "Don't leave me." It was unbearable. Each step away felt like an act of cruelty. I had spent years helping people, leading lost hikers back to safety. Ignoring this voice felt unnatural, wrong. But I pressed forward. The crying only grew more frantic. "Don't go," it screamed, the voice cracking in despair. "Please, it's coming for me." My willpower wavered. I stopped walking, my hands falling away from my ears as the sobs turned into a weak, pitiful whimper. Against every directive and every instinct, I turned around. The trail behind me was empty. No child. No footprints in the dirt. Only the faint green glow of the forest and the towering, twisted trees. For a brief moment, I thought the sound had stopped. Dear friends, please do not forget to subscribe to the channel. I dream of 1,000 subscribers very much. Then I heard it again, quieter now, but much closer. "Help me," it whispered. The voice came from the brush just off the trail. My flashlight flickered as I took a cautious step forward, scanning the undergrowth. "Hello?" I called, my voice shaking. Something shifted. The bushes rustled, and a small figure stepped out, a girl, no older than 8. Her face was pale, streaked with tears, and her wide, frightened eyes locked onto mine. "Please," she whispered, barely audible. It's coming for me. I stepped toward her, lowering my flashlight. You're safe now, I reassured her. I'll get you out of here. Her lips quivered, and for a second, I thought she might start crying again. But then her face twisted into something unnatural, a grotesque, inhuman grin that stretched far too wide. Her eyes darkened into endless pits of blackness, and when she spoke, her voice was no longer hers. It was deep, guttural, and filled with malice. You shouldn't have stopped. The thing lunged at me, its movements jerky and unnatural. I staggered backward, barely managing to raise my rifle. The creature didn't scream, but the forest did. A deafening chorus of distorted cries and howls erupted around me, vibrating through the trees. My flashlight flickered wildly, casting erratic shadows that seemed to twist and shift on their own. I fired a shot. The rifle's sharp crack rang through the air, momentarily drowning out the horrific noise. The creature flinched, its grin faltering, but it didn't stop. I turned and bolted, sprinting down the trail as its uneven footsteps chased after me. The eerie green glow of the forest brightened, pulsing like a heartbeat, while the air grew colder with every step. I reached a marked tree and collapsed against it, my chest heaving. The forest fell into silence. I didn't dare move. My hands trembled as I gripped the rifle, eyes fixed on the path ahead. The creature emerged at the edge of the trail, its body contorted and twitching unnaturally. It stared at me with those soulless, empty eyes, tilting its head as though waiting for something. Then, the symbols carved into the tree began to glow faintly, their light casting eerie patterns across the ground. The creature let out a low, guttural hiss, its grotesque grin contorting into a snarl before it turned and slipped into the darkness. Blackwood National Forest remained eerily quiet long after it vanished. I never reported the night's events to Ranger Captain Wilson. What was I supposed to say? That I nearly died because I disregarded the ranger directives? That I lacked the strength to ignore the sound of a crying child? The laminated card in my pocket suddenly felt heavier, a weighty reminder of my failure. The fourth night was colder than the previous ones, and the green glow seemed to pulse with more intensity, almost as if it was alive. The air crackled with an unsettling static, and I constantly felt unseen eyes tracking my every move. I kept my distance from Devil's Ridge, obeying the directives, but the low hum emanating from that direction was stronger than ever, almost as though it was calling to me. The edges of my laminated card were beginning to fray, the ink smudged from my constant handling. Directive 4 had been on my mind all day: avoid Devil's Ridge after dark. Something watches from the tree line, and it doesn't like to be seen. But what about during the day? For the first few nights, I'd meticulously avoided the ridge, making sure to steer clear of its looming presence. But after the encounter with that crying child, or whatever it was, I had a nagging suspicion that the directives were hiding something from me. The ridge had an unnatural pull, a sense of wrongness that set it apart from the rest of the forest. The atmosphere around it felt heavier, the hum vibrating deep in my chest like an extra heartbeat. I convinced myself it was curiosity that pushed me forward when the sun rose on day 4. But maybe it was defiance. By midday, the ridge came into view. The trees here were different, taller, their blackened trunks scarred as if by an ancient fire. Their branches curled toward the sky, skeletal and claw-like. The soil beneath my boots felt soft, freshly disturbed, and patches of moss emitted a faint glow in the daylight. The air was noticeably colder as I ascended, and with every step, the hum grew louder. Reaching the summit, I paused and surveyed the tree line. Below me, the forest stretched out endlessly, a vast expanse of shadowy green and black. But Devil's Ridge itself felt wrong. The trees here were unnaturally rigid, their leaves unmoving despite the gentle wind. At their bases, shadows pooled unnaturally, darker and deeper than they had any right to be. At the ridge's center, a clearing lay empty, save for a perfect ring of stones arranged in a pattern I didn't recognize. I stepped closer. As I neared the stones, I noticed something unsettling. The shadows they cast didn't match their shape. They stretched unnaturally, jagged and sharp, shifting and twisting even as the stones remained still. A faint whisper tickled the edges of my hearing, too quiet to understand. It wove itself into the hum, threading through my thoughts like an intrusive presence. "Hello?" I called out, immediately regretting it. My voice felt tiny, swallowed whole by the heavy silence. The whispering ceased. For a long moment, nothing happened. The entire forest seemed to hold its breath, and I felt the unmistakable weight of something watching me. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a figure standing just beyond the tree line. It wasn't human. The figure was impossibly tall and unnervingly thin, its body wrapped in shifting layers of darkness that flickered like smoke. Its head cocked at an unnatural angle, and though it lacked a face, I knew it was staring directly at me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The rifle in my hands felt utterly useless. The figure moved forward, gliding instead of walking, its feet never touching the ground. I stumbled backward, my boot catching on one of the stones, and I fell into the center of the circle. The air around me shifted instantly. The forest's green glow deepened, morphing into a sickly, pulsating red. The figure stopped at the edge of the circle, its body writhing and distorting, as if testing an invisible boundary. Then the whispers came back, louder now, multiple voices overlapping, speaking in words I couldn't comprehend. Each syllable pierced my mind like needles, burrowing deep into my thoughts. The figure raised one elongated, shadowy arm and pointed directly at me. I scrambled to my feet, my heartbeat hammering in my ears. The whispers surged, more urgent, more insistent, and the shadows at the edge of the clearing began to shift, creeping toward me like living things. I turned and ran. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away. The hum followed, fading slightly with distance, but the whispers remained, clinging to me like a malevolent echo, looping endlessly in my mind. When I finally reached the base of the ridge, I collapsed against a tree, gasping for breath. The forest around me had fallen back into silence, but the air still crackled with that strange, static energy. My hands trembled as I pulled out the laminated card, gripping it tightly. The directives stared back at me, stark and unyielding. Directive 4, avoid Devil's Ridge after dark. Something watches from the tree line, and it doesn't like to be seen. I had ignored the warning during the day, and it had still found me. That night, I couldn't bring myself to step back into the forest. I remained inside the ranger station, watching the distant tree line through the window, unwilling to let my guard down. But the forest never forgets. Around midnight, the lights in the station flickered, and an unnatural chill filled the air. The whispers returned, soft at first, then rising into a deafening crescendo. When I peered outside, I saw them. Shadows moved between the trees, their forms shifting and twisting unnaturally. They never stepped onto the trail, but they didn't have to. They were waiting for me to make another mistake. Even after the figures dissolved into the darkness and the station lights flickered back to normal, the whispers didn't fade. They lingered, overlapping voices that scratched at the edges of my mind. During the day, they were faint enough to make me question if they were real at all. But as soon as night fell, they grew louder. Sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure from Devil's Ridge, its elongated limbs, its faceless head tilted, as if expecting my return. No matter where I was, I could feel its unseen stare pressing down on me. And the forest felt different. The hum had changed, sharper, more agitated. The eerie green glow that seeped through the station's vents at night pulsed erratically, like a heart unable to find its rhythm. The trees I once relied on for guidance now loomed over me, their etched symbols contorting into patterns I could no longer understand. 3 nights after I violated the directive, it escalated. I was patrolling the southern trail near Mirror Lake when the whispers surged, louder than ever. This time, they weren't outside. I could hear them inside my head, drilling into my thoughts like burrowing insects. You shouldn't have gone there. At first, the words were indistinct, lost in the overlapping voices. But as I walked, they sharpened, repeating over and over, drowning out everything else. You shouldn't have gone there. I halted in the middle of the trail, gripping my rifle with shaking hands. My flashlight flickered, the beam cutting erratically through the darkness. The air was too still. I turned slowly, scanning the trees. For a moment, nothing seemed out of place. Then I saw it, a shadow, impossibly tall and unnaturally thin, standing just beyond the edge of the trail. It remained motionless, silent. But I knew it was watching me. "Stay back," I whispered, my voice unsteady. The shadow tilted its head, the movement slow and deliberate. My flashlight sputtered again, and in that brief instant of darkness, it vanished. The next morning, I noticed something was wrong. Standing in the ranger station's bathroom, I splashed cold water on my face, trying to shake the exhaustion. That's when I caught my reflection. At first, I thought it was just deep shadows under my eyes, dark rings from too many sleepless nights. But then I saw it, a faint black mark just above my collarbone. It wasn't a bruise. It wasn't dirt. The marking was sharp, angular, eerily similar to the carvings on the trees. I scrubbed at it until my skin burned, but it wouldn't fade. It didn't even hurt. If anything, it felt cold, like it wasn't part of me at all. That night, the whispers grew louder. The following evening, I avoided the trails completely. I barricaded myself inside the ranger station, gripping my rifle as if it could shield me, my gaze locked on the tree line beyond the window. Just after midnight, the shadows returned. They drifted between the trees, moving with the same unnatural fluidity as the figure from Devil's Ridge. There were more of them now, dozens, maybe more, and they were getting closer. The voices tore into my mind, scratching at my sanity, repeating the same phrase with relentless intensity. "You broke the directives. You broke the directives. You broke the directives." The shadows halted at the edge of the clearing, surrounding the station like silent sentinels. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, one by one, the station lights began to flicker. The temperature dropped in an instant, my breath turning to mist as I backed into the corner, gripping my rifle so tightly my fingers ached. The whispers ceased. A deafening silence swallowed the station. Then I saw it. The shadow from Devil's Ridge. It stood in the center of the clearing, taller and darker than the rest, its faceless head angled toward the station. The other figures seemed to ripple around it, their shapes bending and distorting as if drawn toward its presence. It raised one long, jagged arm and pointed directly at the window. The glass began to splinter, thin fractures branching outward like a spiderweb. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. Snatching the laminated Ranger directives card from the desk, I bolted, crashing through the back door and into the woods. The forest was awake. The hum was overwhelming, rattling through my bones with every stride. The green luminescence pulsed erratically, warping the shadows into grotesque, shifting figures. The whispers returned, screeching inside my skull like countless voices all clamoring at once. Behind me, the shadows moved. I could hear them rustling through the underbrush, their amorphous forms flickering at the edges of my sight. The entity from Devil's Ridge loomed just beyond them, its stretched limbs moving unnaturally as it glided forward. My lungs burned, my legs wavered, but I didn't dare stop. The directives card dug into my palm, its edges biting into my skin. I only stopped when I reached one of the marked trees. The carvings etched into its bark emitted a faint glow as I collapsed against the trunk, pressing myself into its ridged surface. The shadows recoiled just outside the reach of the tree's glow, their forms writhing and flickering as if restrained by an unseen force. The entity from Devil's Ridge stood at the boundary, its head tilted unnaturally, observing. The whispers ceased. The hum dulled into an eerie quiet. The figure lifted one elongated arm and pointed directly at me. I braced for it to move closer, but instead, it lowered its limb, and the shadows began to slink away, dissolving into the darkness. The figure was the last to retreat. It lingered at the tree's edge, tilting its head one final time before fading into the void beyond the light. When I returned to the station, the dark mark on my collarbone had spread. The jagged, angular lines now stretched across my chest, pulsing with a frigid green luminescence. I didn't understand its meaning, but one thing was certain, the forest had not forgiven me, and it never would. The mark was icy to the touch, as if frost had embedded itself deep beneath my skin. It crawled across my torso in unnatural, branching lines, glowing with a sickly light. No matter what I tried, water, soap, even the sharp edge of a knife in a moment of desperation, the mark remained, unyielding. At first, it seemed inconsequential. It caused no pain, no irritation. but I could feel it spreading, not only on my body but inside me. I began waking in unfamiliar places, far from the station, with no recollection of how I had gotten there. My thoughts unraveled, slipping like grains of sand through my fingers. The forest invaded my dreams, twisted trees, glowing orbs, and the entity from Devil's Ridge, always standing, always watching. The whispers followed me into sleep, threading through my mind like creeping vines, strangling any hope of rest. The forest had changed. The paths I had memorized no longer led where they should. I would turn a bend expecting Mirror Lake and find myself at the base of Devil's Ridge instead. The trees twisted when I wasn't looking, their knotted limbs forming grotesque, almost human-like shapes. The wildlife wasn't the same either. The deer's antlers coiled unnaturally, their glowing eyes locking onto me for far too long. Birds perched in eerie silence, their heads cocked at unsettling angles, watching. The directives still functioned, for now. But they felt fragile, stretched to their limits. I wasn't sure how much longer they would keep me safe. One morning, Ranger Captain Wilson arrived unannounced. His face was grim, his expression void of surprise. Without speaking, he glanced at the mark on my chest and nodded solemnly, as if he had seen it before. "The forest has claimed you," he said, his tone devoid of sympathy. "It happens to those who break the directives." My throat tightened. "What does it mean?" He hesitated before pulling a fresh laminated card from his pocket and sliding it across the desk. The same rules. The same warnings. But at the very bottom, a new line had been added. Directive 9, the claim do not leave. A hollow feeling settled in my stomach. What happens if I try? His gaze was steady, unflinching. "You won't make it past the tree line." The mark worsened with each passing day. The glow burned brighter, the hum of the forest echoing in my ears even within the safety of the station. One night, I awoke to find myself standing in the clearing on Devil's Ridge, the stone circle beneath my feet glowing faintly. I had no memory of walking there. My rifle and flashlight were gone, left behind at the station. The figure from Devil's Ridge waited beyond the trees. "You're one of us now," it murmured, its voice like dry leaves whispering in the wind. "You belong here." I turned and ran, but the forest did not let me go. No matter which path I chose, I always found my way back to the ridge. The stones grew brighter each time. The shadows no longer stayed at the edges of my vision, they crept closer, moving with intention. Even the animals stared, their movements eerily synchronized, as if they were no longer just creatures but something more. On my final night, the whispers became unbearable. The hum of the forest grew into a deafening roar. The green glow surged like a heartbeat, consuming everything. My laminated directives card lay in front of me, its corners worn from use. The words on it blurred and twisted, revealing their true nature, not guidance, but a warning. A warning meant to keep something contained. The mark on my chest burned cold, spreading across my arms and neck like creeping tendrils. I could feel it pulling me, dragging me toward Devil's Ridge, toward the circle of stones. I fought it for as long as I could, clutching my rifle as if it could ground me, but my body was no longer under my control. At midnight, I stepped outside. The forest was alive with unnatural light. Shadows twisted and swayed, forming a path straight to the ridge. The entity was waiting in the clearing, larger now, its shape more defined. Its shadowy tendrils reached out as I stepped into the circle. The whispers stopped. Silence enveloped everything. Then the stones flared, the hum intensified, and the mark on my chest ignited with searing cold. The ground beneath me cracked apart, revealing the hollow gate, a gaping rift of green energy. The last thing I saw before darkness consumed me was the forest itself bending toward it, its trees twisting and writhing as if they were feeding it. I awoke, but the world was not the same. The trees loomed taller, their bark blackened. The sky stretched into an endless abyss of deep green. The trails had vanished, replaced by shifting paths that changed beneath my feet. When I tried to speak, no sound came out. I looked down. The mark had spread, covering every inch of my skin, glowing softly in the darkness. In the distance, faint lights flickered between the trees, not fireflies, but moving shadows, gliding through the forest as if they were alive. I was no longer a ranger. I had become something else. And this forest, this prison, had made me its own. Now I walk its endless paths, watching, waiting, just as the shadows once watched me. When the next ranger arrives, I will be there, standing at the edge of the tree line, waiting for them to break the directives. Because the forest never lets you leave. What do you think will happen to the next ranger? Will he or she be able to survive by following the directives? Write your impressions of the story in the comments. Subscribe to the channel, like it, and see you in the next story.